Welcome to the DIY Wealth Canada podcast, a show by independent investors for independent investors. Join hosts Bob and Nelson as they discuss investing, personal finance, and much more, all from a fiercely self-reliant Canadian perspective. As a reminder, nothing you're about to hear is investment advice. Thanks for listening and enjoy the show.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of DIY Wealth Canada podcast. I'm Bob, and along with me is Nelson. Today we're going to talk about RESP because we were tweeting back and forth about it the other day, and we thought this would be an interesting episode to discuss about RESP, all the different strategies, and all that sorts. So RESP stands for Registered Education Savings Plan. So it's a little bit similar to your Registered Retirement Savings Plan, but RESP is really used for your kids' education. As we know, post-secondary education could get pretty expensive. So this is the way the Canadian government kind of incentivizes parents, grandparents to save for their kids, grandkids, right? So we want to talk about this and how one could maximize RESP and the money compound over the course of 18 to however long. So Nelson, any other things to add before we get started?
I'm just glad that we're doing this episode because I think one of the things that Canadian retail investors don't really understand very well is RESPs. They're a little bit complicated. We'll get into some of the details here as we go along. They're complicated, and the matching and the rules and so on, it's not as easy as just kind of putting your money in, index funds or whatever and letting that grow over time. There's a lot of rules that you have to make sure that you know. And as a whole, I think that maybe perhaps the whole thing is probably a little bit too complicated, and that kind of makes a few people just sort of avoid the whole thing altogether. So if we can help kind of answer some of those questions, I think that's a good service for Canadians.
Mm-hmm. So the one thing to keep in mind, I mentioned about RRSP. RESP is similar to RSP, or is the money that you put in, and RESP grows tax deferred. But the key note here is, unlike the RRSP, the money you put in an RESP is not tax deductible. So you're using your after tax money to put into RESP. You do not get any tax deduction when you file your taxes. Now, the benefit for an RESP is that money inside will and should grow tax deferred. And the idea is when you start using money from an RESP, it's not you that's taking out the money, it's your kid or your child. And because when you're a post-secondary student, you're typically not making much income. Your tax bracket, you should be at the lowest tax bracket. So when you take out money from RESP, you're essentially not paying any taxes. So that's the idea. Like you're letting, say you put in $1,000 a year, and that money will grow, tax deferred, and then when your kid takes out the money, they're essentially not paying any taxes. So that's the key benefit. Now the other benefit is there's some level of matching, or there's some incentives from the government. So that's another thing that you might want to look for when you open an RESP.
Yeah, I think that effectively what it comes down to is this. It's essentially a way for higher income parents and grandparents, and really anyone, because Bob, anyone can contribute to someone's RESP, correct? Like it's not just limited to parents and grandparents. So anyone can, but mostly like it's going to be parents and grandparents. Like that's who's, you're not going to find a stranger on the street and tell them that, hey, I'm going to, pay for your kid's education. That doesn't happen. So it's a way to effectively kind of transfer money to children to pay for their education, and then get that income taxed at their income rate, which, as Bob, as you mentioned, is usually very, very low, if not zero, effectively. So it's a great way to both give that gift and then give that gift in a way that minimizes the tax burden for your child, grandchild, etc. And the way to give that gift, like I'm a big fan of, maybe we should do a whole episode on inheritance one day, but I'm a big fan of giving when the person most needs it, when the receiver most needs it. And in just about every case, that's right when they turn 18 and they have a, college degree, whatever, to pay for. So Bob, let me kind of, take this in a bit of a different direction for a minute here. What would you say to people who, online and wherever you see this attitude that college is a scam and college is so expensive and so on and so on? So what would you say to people who are RESP resistant, who don't like the idea of putting that money into this sort of account that has a very specific use? What would you say to those people who were like scared that junior's going to get the money and then not be able to use it because they don't choose to go off to school?
Well, I think the term is pretty general. It's for post-secondary education. So it's not just going to university, you go to college, you go to trade schools. Really, it's any post-secondary. So if you decide to become an electrician by going to a trade school, you can use your RESP. I think there's no reason why you wouldn't want to put some money in RESP. Now, I did mention that the government kind of contribute some parts. So that particular thing is called the Canada Education Savings Grant. So the government will contribute up to a lifetime of maximum $7,200. And that's typically $500 per year if you contribute $2,500 to the RESP. So essentially, if you contribute $2,500 per year, you get additional contribution from the Canadian government for $500. You could get that Canadian or Canada Education Savings Grant up to the end of the calendar year when the child turns 17. So essentially, you have, if you do the calculation, I think you have about 14 and a half to max out the $7,200 from the government. And that's free money. So why not take advantage of the $7,200? And if you miss 1 year, like say you didn't contribute $2,500 in year 2, you could contribute additional money to get that grant. So I don't see why you wouldn't want to open an RESP and just let your money compound tax deferred. Now, like you said, Nelson, some people might be a bit put up on the idea of post-secondary education and thinking that it's universities. Only I mentioned it's not just universities, but the term is really loosely defined. It said essentially it's used, RESP is used for any post-secondary expenses. So it could be any education expenses. So it's not just tuition. It could be on books. It could be on rent. It could be on laptops, computers, living expenses, even tools or transportation. So there's really no list of approved quote unquote expenses. It's really up to your interpretation. So as long as your child is in a post-secondary education, you could use the RESP for really any expenses. Now, the RESP is also not tied to Canadian post-secondary school only. You could go to a school outside of Canada. Right? So there's some rules, right? For example, if you're in Canada, you have to enroll in a Canadian post-secondary school level program that lasts at least 3 consecutive weeks. That's pretty short, if you ask me. Outside of Canada, the program must last at least 13 weeks for non-university or 3 weeks for university. So again, it's very lenient, I think. So it's really good when it comes to RESP. There's really no reason you don't want to take advantage of the RESP. Now, the Canadian government do have a list of designated educational institutions that are approved outside of Canada. So if you have any doubt, check that list to make sure that the school your child attends does qualify for the RESP expenses for usage.
Yeah, I would urge anybody listening that, so I will share part of my own personal story here, is that I never went to university or college or whatever. And in hindsight, that was probably a bad move on my part. Now, it all worked out okay. like I've done well financially, but it was all kind of self-education, and I did that over the years. But looking back on it, I truly feel that it was like, this is probably not a smart move on my part, but it happened, so I have to deal with it. So I would urge anybody listening, just look at the statistics in terms of university graduates versus non-university graduates, how much more that they make, and or whether it's trade school or whether it's whatever. Education is generally a good investment. Sometimes it doesn't work out, yes, but generally it's a good investment, and it's very highly correlated to earning more over time. So I would just I'm concerned about that attitude of school is a scam and whatever, because I firmly believe that it's not a scam. So just keep that in mind if perhaps that's your outlook on things. The other thing I want to mention is that, Bob, you can take any unused RESP money that your child doesn't use, and you can transfer that to your RRSP, correct? Now, there's some rules there in terms of you have to have contribution room, and you have to return that grant from the government and so on. But there is that option for people who maybe are concerned that junior won't go off to school. They can transfer that to their RSP, correct?
Correct. So there's a contribution limit, $50,000 to an RESP. And if your child doesn't use up all the RESP money, or if your child doesn't attend post-secondary education, you could transfer the RESP to an RSP, again, assuming you have room, and the maximum amount that you could transfer is $50,000. Now, there are various ways to move the money if your child doesn't attend post-secondary education. So, for example, you could transfer one RESP to another RESP as long as you don't exceed the maximum lifetime contribution limit of $50,000. So you have more than one child. If your older child doesn't go to post-secondary school, then you could transfer the RESP to your second child or third child. We talked about potentially transferring to RSP. Now, you could also close the RESP. I wouldn't recommend doing that, because when you close the RESP and you don't use the RESP money, all the grant money must be returned to the government. Any personal contributions up to a maximum of $50,000 will return to the subscriber, which is the person that opens out the RESP tax-free. Any gains inside the RESP will be taxed at your marginal tax rate plus an additional 20%, 12% if you live in Quebec. So closing an RESP is typically not recommended, because you end up with a big tax bill in the end. But I would say RESP, generally speaking, is pretty efficient. Now, one thing that people get confused is there are three different types of RESP. So there's individual RESPs, which is when one child is named as the beneficiary, and individual RESPs can be set up by anybody. So it could be the parent, could be the grandparent, could be anybody. Now there's family RESPs, where it's siblings. So by blood or adoption, our name is the beneficiaries. Family RESPs can set up by a direct family member, so parents, step-parents, or grandparents. The key benefit in our family RESP is that the money is shared. So if one child decides not to attend post-secondary school, then you can use the money for the other child. Now, there's also group RESP, which is something you don't want to touch. Group RESP is basically you contribute your money, and that money is pooled together with other people's contributions. And we don't want to get into this, but there are a lot of companies, financial institutions that sell group RESPs, and generally speaking, they're not great. So I would recommend avoid group RESPs at all costs. You could Google group RESP, you'll hear lots of bad stories, terrible stories. Just stay away from group RESPs. And if somebody is trying to sell you group RESPs, run away. Right? Stick with either individual RESPs or family RESPs.
Yeah, I'll quickly add here that pretty much every time you see an ad for some kind of RESP product out there, whatever, I was watching some sports recently. I can't remember the company's name, which is probably good because we don't want to name it. But there's a company that was aggressively advertising RESPs, and those are almost always group RESPs. And yeah, like Bob said, the reason why they can advertise aggressively is because there's a lot of money to be made on those fees, and it's just, yeah, they're not a good idea. I would recommend that everyone just avoid them with prejudice. So let's talk about kind of some RESP strategies, and kind of let's zoom out here a little bit more now that, Bob, you've done a really nice job of explaining some of the details. So the tweet that I put out that sort of inspired this episode was, I said that I like the strategy of sort of strategically putting enough in RESPs to pay maybe 70-75% of your kid or grandkid's education, and then that puts some responsibility on the receiver, the child, to get a job, whatever, to come up with the other kind of 25% needed to complete their education, plus a little spending money or whatever. And that's like this nice balance between the two. Bob, what do you think about that in terms of sort of creating that kick in the pants that kids might need growing up? Or are you more of an advocate of, hey, I want to take care of my children, make sure that they have enough to pay the entire way? What's your thoughts on that strategy?
So for me personally, my parents paid for all my university education. So I'm super, super grateful for them doing that. I mean, I went through UBC with an engineering degree, so it was not the cheapest education. Now, I didn't go through master's or PhD, so that could have been a lot more if I did. So I'm very grateful for my parents, but I think and I believe the kids need to take on some responsibilities as well. I see a lot of parents that think about kids' education where they're putting money aside and then kind of forgetting their retirement savings in some ways, which is detrimental to the parents. Because when you're retired, when you don't have another source of income and you don't have enough retirement savings, you're kind of screwed. Whereas a child, they have options. So when you're 18 or however old you're going through university, there are options of earning income. Kind of like what Nelson, you were saying, a student could work part-time to make some part-time income. You could get scholarship, or borrow money like bursaries or student loans. I think there's benefits of not covering 100% of the post-secondary education. Looking back, I was lucky. I didn't have to worry about my post-secondary education costs, but that doesn't mean I was slacking off. I got scholarship. I got money by having good grades during university or BBC. I was working through co-op during my engineering degree, so I was earning some money as well. And I wasn't spending like crazy. I was living like a poor student. Yeah, so I generally agree that kids need to kind of be responsible for their post-secondary education to some degree. It would be awesome if the parents could fund 100%, but that may not teach the child the necessary financial knowledge. But if you step back a bit, it also depends on the kid or the child. If somebody is very financial responsible, then maybe paying 100% of the post-secondary education is okay. So it depends, right? So that's kind of my thoughts.
One thing I'll add is, Bob and I, we both went to high school kind of 25 years ago. We're old. Sorry to all the kids listening, but we're super old. And it's a lot different trying to find a part-time job nowadays versus 25 years ago. Fast food back in the day was a lot of part-time kids, etc., and now it's a lot of temporary foreign workers in Canada. That's the reality. I don't want to get political here. It's just the reality. And there are many reasons why this has happened. And one of the reasons is that you look at high school kids now versus 25 years ago, and 25 years ago it was go get a job would be good for you, and now there's so much emphasis on education that there are a lot of parents now that are telling their children, no, like, don't get a job. You need that time to study and get your grades up so you can go to a good university so you can get set up for the rest of your life. And what's happened, I think, is that employers have responded to that, and employers have said, okay, fine, we're not going to hire as many students because of the various reasons, whether it's temporary foreign workers but I want to focus maybe a little bit right now on the fact that it's to be a good student takes time, and to be a good employee is sort of the opposite of being a good student. To be a good employee, what do you need? You need availability, kind of sort of whenever the business needs it. You need the ability to work hard. You need the ability to focus on that job rather than focusing on school. So you put all that together. And my point is that it's harder for kids to find jobs these days. And that makes that strategy that I talked about making junior kind of make up the rest of the money. That's a lot harder than what it was 25 years ago. 25 years ago, all of my friends had part-time jobs after school. We all did whatever. It was mostly fast food, but a little bit of other stuff as well. Summer jobs were a lot easier to get. There's more of those, and so on. So that's another factor that perhaps parents should consider in terms of setting their kids up with the RESP. What do you think about that, Bob?
I think I agree with that in terms of part-time jobs are harder to find nowadays. Having said that, I do think some work experience is invaluable to younger people, just having that experience dealing with different types of people in a different environment and home, and kind of have to learn problem-solving skills, social skills. Social skills, maybe many of the younger folks are lacking, especially nowadays people just use their smartphones to text, and that social interaction is missing. So I think working part-time would bring in a lot of experience, and that will help. And also it gives the child a bit of perspective in terms of, hey, if I don't have an education, what might that look like if I can get like career advancement, right? So Nelson, you talked about going to school, you could end up with a higher pay job, or maybe a blue collar job, or that kind of stuff. Whereas if you don't have an education, you're out of high school, you're more focused on labor type of jobs, so more physical demanding. So that's something you could read about it, but when you're actually working hard, doing manual labor, that comes across easier. So I think there are benefits to working part-time. And also I mentioned about scholarship, right? It kind of puts some incentive for the kids to get good grades as a way to pay for their post-secondary education. So I think, generally speaking, I do think RESP is great, but just like personal finance is personal, it depends on many different situations.
Yeah, I like the scholarship angle that you mentioned, because I think that's a big one that a lot of kids, they just don't apply to scholarships because they assume that they're not going to get them. I remember when I was in high school, there was a guy who I went to school with. He did not have a job. His parents he was one of the rare ones where his parents were like, hey, like, don't get a job because we want you to focus on your studies. And then in that kind of that 6 months of these last 6 months of high school, it was, okay, now we want you to apply for scholarships like it's your full-time job. Like he was set up, he had a great average. He was accepted into whatever school it was. I don't remember what it was. And then it was, okay, now you have to really push the scholarship game. And he did so well that I believe his first year tuition was covered by scholarships. And This was just from applying, from seeking out the scholarships, and the schools have that information. Like there's so much information that the schools have. It's just a matter of doing the work, doing it right. And that's exactly what he did. And on a per hour basis, he was probably making 4 times what the rest of us were at our part-time jobs. So don't forget that scholarship angle. Very, very important.
Yeah, for sure. Now, I just want to go back a little bit and talk about some of the rules. We kind of missed that a little bit. I mentioned there is a 50,000 lifetime contribution limit per beneficiary, and you could have multiple RESPs per child. So you just like TFSA and RSP, you really need to keep track of how much money you put in so you don't over contribute. Because just like RSP and TFSA, there's over contribution penalty, which is 1% per month tax on top of the over contribution amount until you withdraw it from the RESP. I talked about the government of Canada will match or give some contribution. So it's really 20% of your annual contribution, right? So maximum of $500 for $2,500 of your contribution. Be able to match that 20% until the child turns 17. But you could keep the RESP open. That was one of the questions many people have. So just because you have RESP open, it doesn't mean you have to collapse it or withdraw all the money when your child goes to post-secondary education. You could actually contribute to an RESP until 31 years after it was first opened. You could start withdrawing money from an RESP when your beneficiary turns 18 and the beneficiary enrolls in a qualified post-secondary program. Now, if the beneficiary, say they take a gap year or 2 years off between high school and post-secondary education, that's totally fine. You can leave the fund in the RESP until end in 35th year after it's open. And there are some cases where you can extend that out further. So really, what I'm trying to say is you have a lot of flexibilities in terms of using up that RESP fund. So just because your child doesn't go to university or college or trade school right after high school doesn't mean RESP is wasted. There are people that decide to take a year off or 2 just to understand what they want to do in life, and that's totally fine. I actually would encourage that because when you're 18 and 19 and 17, you're still so young, you don't really know what you want to do. So going traveling or working part-time or whatever, that's actually very, very valuable life experience. So I would encourage that. So RESP. Now, another thing that I wrote a post about it is if you do some calculation, the Canada Education Savings Fund is $7,200 maximum. And if the government can match up to $500 per year, that means you'll get, and if you contribute to the RESP every year by contributing $2,500, if you do the calculation, that's actually, I think, 14.5 or 14.4 years that you'll be able to get that full $7,200. And remember, RESP has a $50,000 contribution limit. So that means there's a difference of $14,000, right? So there's this thing called front loading your RESP. So essentially, when your child is born, you could technically front load the RESP by putting $14,000 in year 1, plus the $2,500 you have in money. That way, you could let the money compound over the course of the RESP. Now, I realize not everybody has $14,000 lying around, especially when you're a young family. We certainly didn't do that for our 2 kids. We did not front load the $14,000 when they were born. So we're actually doing a little bit of catch up now. And that's totally okay. Right? When you're a young family, you just may not have that money lying around to front load the RESP. So you slowly max out this $50,000 limit through the course of RESP. But the earlier you max out be better because you then will take advantage of the compounding.
Yeah, that's a good seg into what I want to talk about next, which is kind of the investment strategies. We've gone over the basics of it and everything, and I want to tell a story about another friend of mine growing up who his parents had put money aside for him in his RESP, and so I graduated in 2001. So I remember in 1999 and 2000, his dad telling everyone that his son's education was he was going to have enough to pay for everything with money left over because that money was invested in tech stocks, and tech stocks of course were doing very well then. So by the time his son graduated in 2001 and the bubble had burst, his RESP lost 30-40% of its value, whatever it ended up being, and it went from being able to pay for everything to I think he got like the first 2 years paid for, and then after that he had to take out loans. So I think it's really important to recognize that it's a little bit like retirement, where it's like as you're getting closer to that time when it's time for your children to use the RESP, it's really that time to get more conservative and to introduce more bonds into the portfolio or whatever to kind of keep it more conservative. Bob, would you agree? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's something I've been debating back and forth on. If you look at our investment portfolio, we're more or less 100% in stocks. Right now, for both of our kids, we invest 100% of their RESP funds in XEQT, which is the iShares All Equities ETF. So basically 100% in equities. My son, my oldest, is going to turn teenager in a few years. So we should be going more conservative soon, but we have not done that. I mean, you kind of could look at the different research. Some says you need to become more conservative as they get closer to 18 or when you start taking out funds from RESP. But some also say by moving to bonds, you're losing that potential return. So again, I think general rule of thumb is you want to be more conservative, but that also depends on your risk tolerance and whether you have some money saved aside in addition to RESP. So I think our plan is to slowly shift away from our XEQT as our child or our kids get older. We probably won't go like 60% bonds, 40% equities. We'll probably go still relatively aggressive. Maybe we go from XEQT go to either XGROW or VGROW, which is the 80-20 ETF. So 80% equities, 20% bonds. And if we feel like the market is too high and, valuation is out of whack, maybe we'll lean more towards 60-40. So we'll kind of be XDAO, VDAO, so 60-40 composition. And we're still trying to decide. So that's a discussion I need to have with my wife to figure out. But for now, we're doing 100% in stocks for both of our kids of RESP. But yeah, like when you start needing to tap into the RESP fund, you kind of want to go into conservation mode. You don't want to have the RESP fund drop quite a bit because market fluctuation. So that's something to consider for sure.
Yeah, I think too that my example that I used is it's pretty much the worst possible case scenario that could have happened. And in hindsight, it's like, yeah, was that poor planning? Probably. But the result was, pretty much as bad as it could have gotten. And perhaps that guy got unlucky with that result. Like ultimately at the end of the day, like a 30, 40, 50% drop in the market doesn't happen very often. And statistically, you are more likely to come out ahead if you focus more on equities and you make sure you have that equity exposure even as your child gets older. The other thing that you can do is that, once your kid hits maybe like 13, 14, is you keep contributing, but those contributions maybe go into a little bit lower risk assets. And then that way it's like you still get that growth, but you're slowly diversifying away from it as time goes on. And that sort of minimizes that risk. Because what I'm afraid of is that people will look at that story and they'll say, hey, I better try to time the market. I better, okay, like I think stocks are overvalued now. I better make this big change in my child's RESP years before they're scheduled to start taking it out. And that can be also a terrible, terrible move. So just be careful, but at the same time, like this stuff is complicated and it's easy to try to make a macro bet here. And I think that most investors should not make macro bets. They're just not very good at it. I think we got just a few more minutes left, Bob, but I want to end this with kind of the strategy that my parents used for me and my sister growing up, and how I think it's a really wonderful kind of strategy for anyone who's looking to put money in RESPs and save for their children's future, their children's education. So what my dad did is he took all of the free government money that was available. So in terms of child tax credits, any other kind of free money that he got from the government for me and my sister, and that money was put aside for us. Now, he wasn't an RESP believer. He didn't think that the account was flexible enough, so he didn't want to do it that way. But he did take the money and put it aside. And by the time we both graduated from high school, we had this nice little nest egg. In fact, my money that my dad put aside for me was what bought my first rental property. I was 18 and I bought my very first rental property with that money. And it was just this massive, massive leg up for me. And it really didn't cost him anything out of his pocket because he was able to leverage that free government money. And I just think it was such a wonderful strategy that, not only gave us a leg up, but also he was able to do so using that free money that the government gives out. What do you think of that strategy, Bob? And is that something that, at the end of the day, a lot of it's mental accounting, whether you take money and you save it and give it to your kids versus taking that free money and giving it to your kids. But what do you think of that? Is that something that is good, or is it maybe you do something a little bit different?
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. You adapted that. I think again, personal finance is very personal. So I think it really depends on your situation, how you are as an investor per se. So I think if you're the type of investor like your dad, then maybe it makes sense. But that definitely requires a bit of mental accounting, I think. So I think generally speaking, it's just easier putting the money in an RESP and index it and let the money grow. Obviously, there are other strategies you could use, just like any investment accounts. You could just put all the money in NVIDIA. You could foresee the future kind of thing, but you're also taking on a lot of risk. So it just depends on what your situation is like and what your goals are.
Yeah, I think too that the big disadvantage to avoiding the RESP route was that he forfeited that government grant, and the worry is that, well, if we decided not to go to school, there was that there wasn't that flexibility. But at the end of the day, like you talked about earlier, he could have taken that money and he could have put it in his RSP and then, kind of kept it that way and gotten the advantage of the grant growing in the meantime. So of course you get that $500 per year, you invest it, and guess what? That starts to compound, and all you have to do is just give back the $500. So there's a big advantage to taking the grant, even if you do eventually have to give it back. But ultimately, like I said, if he takes that money and the worst case scenario is to transfer it to his RSP, he could have then said, okay, the value of this is worth, however much. I've transferred that to my RSP, and in exchange, I'm going to take this cash that I have and sort of give that as a gift. So it ends up being kind of this zero sum for the parent helping out. So in terms of just putting the money in the RSP and taking the grant, I really don't think there's a whole lot of downside to it. I think it's all really upside. And if the worst case scenario, you have to put it in your RSP at some point, way down the line, you've gotten that compounding effect, and you can just kind of, do a little bit more mental accounting and just, okay, like, here's the money I'm putting in the RSP, here's the money that I'm going to give to my child, and the child still gets a leg up, even if the money isn't used for education. So it's a no-brainer to do it, even if you're not a big fan of college, even if you think that perhaps your child isn't going to go to some sort of post-secondary. There's all these options in terms of trade school, in terms of specialty courses, other things like that they can use to just better themselves in the future. I think that education is going to get more and more valuable over time as the workforce gets smarter and more specialized.
For sure. And I think it's hard to, like, when you have a newborn, it's hard to predict what your child is going to do in the 18 years. So it's kind of no-brainer to just take advantage of the RESP and let your money grow tax deferred. And why not say, like, I always question why people say no to free money, right? Free money from the government or even free money from your employer. I'm talking about the RSP matching from employers. It always boggles my mind when people say no to that kind of free money. So, like what Nelson said, even if your child doesn't end up going to post-secondary education, there are so many different ways to use up the RESP. So you might as well take advantage of it when you can. So that's kind of my thoughts.
Exactly, 100% agree. And I think that for a lot of people, I was thinking about this actually the other day in terms of just kind of a more general. I feel like there's so many people out there who are looking for one more kind of hint or piece of advice, kind of this silver bullet of, this is the thing that's going to make me a great investor. This is the little soundbite that's going to make me so good at compounding my money or whatever, that they overcomplicate things, and the really simple stuff that actually matters at the end of the day in terms of just investing or for RESPs is that free money from the government. It's just, we look for this magic thing when the solution is just more of the simple things that anyone can do. And I strongly feel that in terms of free money, where it's like, don't galaxy brain your way out of something like this. Just take the money. Like, take the money, and then if it doesn't work out, figure it out later. But for now, take the money. Like, it's free money. Take it.
For sure. All right, I think it's time for us to wrap it up. Anything else for you to add, Nelson, before we wrap it up?
One thing I'm going to do for this show is Bob has a fantastic post on RESPs. I'm going to put the link to that in the comments, and anyone who's interested, I encourage them to read that. It's a fantastic resource. It goes through everything, and just, it's all you need, really. If you're interested, if you want to go down that path, highly recommended.
All right, thanks, Nelson. And I think we'll wrap it up for today. And thanks to everybody for listening. And if you like our podcast, we would really appreciate if you leave a comment or leave a review on on Spotify or Amazon or Apple or YouTube, and subscribe to the podcast.
All right, thanks everyone. See you next week.
If you enjoyed the show, make sure you subscribe to never miss another episode. For more from Bob, visit his site at tawcan.com. That's TAWCAN, all one word. Nelson can be found at CanadianDividendInvesting.com. They're both on Twitter as well. Just search for Tawcan or CDI Newsletter. Thanks. See you next time.